Hello everyone and welcome. So what armors, body armors, did the Vikings use? Because I think we are used to two ends of the spectrum here. One end being the stupid looking Viking wearing soft leather shirts that wouldn't protect them at all, just looked stupid, and that is not historically accurate at all. And then on the other end of the spectrum we have the Viking who's wearing either Gambeson or Mail. Now that's mostly correct, but I kind of want to go deeper into it because it's a little bit too oversimplified. And I kind of want to explore subjects like how much mail armor would be common during the Viking Age. Is it 50% of all Vikings using mail? Is it 20? Is it 1? What is it? How common was mail? Then I also want to explore if the Vikings did or did not use any other kind of armor. Maybe they used a little bit of other things. I don't know. We'll see. And also, what do we mean with Gambeson? Because Gambeson is a very vague term. You can have very thin Gambesons, very thick ones. They can be constructed in different ways, and all of that matters for how protective it is. So I basically just want to explore all of that to understand how a Viking army would be equipped in reality. Now, in the previous video, I talked about if the Vikings did or did not use helmets, and to which degree they used helmets, what kind of helmets, and so on. I also talked about what is a Viking, and so on. So if you haven't checked that video out, go check it out. This video here is kind of a part 2 to that video. So anyways, let's get started. So we kind of all believe that all Vikings would have Gambesons. That isn't actually entirely true. Most Vikings would actually have no armor whatsoever, which means they would basically just walk around in normal clothes, even on the battlefield. And of course, that might sound a little bit strange, because why not just wear a Gambeson? It's cheap, it's easy to make, why not use that? Well, Gambesons during the Viking Age were constructed in a specific way that made them really good to be coats. They were made mostly out of wool, which is warm, and therefore wearing your Gambeson, Viking Gambeson, when fighting is actually really impractical, because it's made of wool. You will get very warm, and therefore way more tired, and therefore it can actually be a disadvantage to have such an armor. Depends on the temperature, of course. In winter, more Vikings would probably use Gambesons, but as a general rule, approximately 50 to 70% of the Vikings would actually wear no armor whatsoever. And it kind of makes sense if you look at Gambeson as a coat. If you today were going to fight in a medieval battle, would you bring with you your modern coat or a hoodie or something like that? Well, probably not, because it's only a coat. It's not going to protect you a lot, and it is going to make you extremely warm when fighting. Of course, again, this depends on the temperature. If you're fighting in the middle of winter, many more so-called Vikings would wear Gambesons. Now we come to the most popular Viking armor, the Gambeson. And this was a very common so-called armor during the Viking Age, mainly because it was used as a coat, and Scandinavia is very cold, so basically everyone needs to have a coat to protect them from the cold. The problem with the word Gambeson is that it is a very vague term. Gambesons can range from really thin to really thick. They can be constructed in different ways, and Vikings had their specific ways of constructing their Gambesons, because Gambesons were mainly coat, as I said, which means that most Gambesons would be made out of wool. This particular one is made out of wool felt with linen on the inside. And that is actually part of the reason why Gambesons were not that common, because they were extremely warm to wear. Other Gambesons from other parts of the world and from before and after in history were most commonly made out of linen, and were therefore much less warm to wear, and therefore could be used more for fighting. So this is a linen Gambeson. I actually think it's cotton, but historically it would be linen. And this is just more practical to wear when it's warm outside than this wool Gambeson. Now we come to the thickness. Because Gambesons were originally developed to be used under mail. Because when you're wearing mail alone, well, you have basically bare metal on your skin or on your clothes. And this means that whenever you get hit by any kind of weapon, a lot of that force from that blow is going to go straight into your body, straight into your bones, and you may potentially break something from that hit, even though it doesn't pierce the mail. So if you have a Gambeson under, what that will do is that it will create some kind of a pillow effect that will spread out the weight more on your body and mean that you have way less chances of breaking something if you get hit. And it also just makes the armor more comfortable to wear. Now, after the fall of the Roman Empire, when armies were not so organized and everyone had to buy their own equipment and so on, mail armor was too expensive for most people, and therefore the other people who needed armor started developing thicker Gambesons that could be used as armor on their own. And that is when the thicker Gambeson appeared. And that Gambeson actually eventually got very, very thick in the late Middle Ages because it was the only armor of some people. However, during the Viking Age, as I said, Gambesons were not designed to be armors, they were designed to be coats. And the thing is, if you have a really, really thick wool Gambeson or coat, you will get extremely hot. Therefore, most Gambesons were actually rather thin. This particular one is actually really, really thick for a Viking Gambeson. It is historical, but it is very thick compared to what would be usual. And Gambesons, or so-called Gambesons, could range down to something like this. So basically just a thick tunic. And if you have your normal tunic with a thick tunic on top, you will get warm enough in most cases, and that's all you need. That's all they try to achieve. And that's why when we are saying that the Vikings used Gambeson, that is kind of misleading, because a lot of those Gambesons were actually really thin and therefore wouldn't offer as much protection as some other Gambesons which were thicker. And now we come to mail. And mail is commonly known as being the heaviest armor a Viking would wear. And that's mostly true. But there is a lot more to it than simply mail. So let's talk a little bit about Viking mail armor. Because of course, Viking mail armor is quite specific compared to all the other mails. You have different sizes of rings, you have different measurements of sleeves and length and stuff like that, and so on. So first of all, the ring size of Viking mail was usually in between 7 to 9 millimeters of rings. As a comparison, Roman mail armor was usually from 5 to 7 millimeters, so usually smaller rings, and later medieval mail armor was usually from 8 to 11 millimeters of rings. It could even go up to 12 millimeters. And usually, the smaller rings you have, the better the armor is. Because of course, in mail armor, you'll always have some holes that things can be poked through. The smaller the ring, the less can be poked through, and therefore you have a smaller chance of the ring bursting open and actually leaving a gap in your armor. However, it does mean that your armor is heavier if you have smaller rings, and that it's harder to make and more time consuming to make. So this particular mail shot here is made of 8mm rings, so it's kind of an average Viking mail shot in terms of ring size. Now we come to the shape of Viking mail armor. Because of course you have the classic Lorca Hamata from the Romans with the shoulder guards, you have mail hauberks that are really long and stuff like that. How were Viking mail shirts designed? So mostly it would be a mail shirt, not a mail hauberk, which means that it would be rather short, going down to around mid-thigh. That is approximately the length of this mail shirt here. Now we have the sleeves. This particular one has a bit long sleeves compared to the average Viking sleeve, which would be around down to the elbow. So this one has a bit long sleeves, but it still is within the historical range, and it could perfectly well exist with such sleeves. And then finally, how common were these? Because we always told that Vikings had either Gambesons or potentially mail. How common were mail? Well, in terms of the research I've done and the research I've seen other people do, it was probably common to have around 2 to 4% of so-called Vikings wearing mail. So mail was actually really rare. Now, if you remember last video where I talked about helmets, I said that it was around 1 to 2% of Vikings that had helmets. And that's less than the one having mail, which means that some of them would actually have mail without a helmet. And this is quite illogic because a mail shirt was really expensive. So around 200 to 400 silver coins at that time, which is approximately equivalent today to 50,000 to 100,000 US dollars. So really expensive for that time. So really expensive with mail. Helmets were at that time around 50 to 100 silver coins, which would today be equivalent to 10,000 to 25,000 US dollars. Also really expensive, but way less expensive than mail. As a comparison, a horse would be worth 30 to 50 silver coins, which is approximately equal to 8,000 to 50,000 US dollars today. And a shield would be worth 3 to 6 silver coins, which is approximately 1,000 US dollars today. So mail is really extremely expensive. So the question is, why was it more common than helmets? Because helmets protect a very important part of your body, the head, and mail, well, it protects a really important part of your body. So of course it protects the heart, the lungs, organs, everything like that. But the head still is more important to protect on average. Now, the reason I believe that mail was more common is that wearing a helmet is extremely impractical. If I tried to wear a helmet during a whole day, I could basically not do anything. Breathing would be horrible. I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink, I couldn't do anything basically. And if I want to take it off to do something, well, I have to carry around a helmet in my hands. It's extremely impractical. And if I have a spear and a shield, well, how do I carry a helmet when I have a spear and a shield? Extremely impractical. A mail shirt, on the other hand, I can wear it all day, no problem. I've actually done it quite a lot, where worn this exact mail shirt for entire days. And of course, it's not practical, but it's perfectly possible, and it's fine. And I think that is the main reason why the Vikings would not use helmets to such a large degree, but instead focus on getting mail. The second thing is that, yes, the head is extremely important to protect in the fight. However, you can rather easily dodge back, and you will naturally do this if something comes at your head, you'll naturally dodge it back. And dodging back with the head is really easy because it's on top of your body, so you can dodge back. You cannot so easily dodge back with your body, because then you need to move back your entire body, right? And then we also have the fact that, yes, a mail shirt is really expensive. However, it's rather easy to make compared to something like a helmet. Reason being that if you just learn how to assemble mail, you can sit there in a long time just assembling mail. It doesn't take a lot of skill. It takes a lot of skill to make a helmet. And that could mean that more people made mail shirts, therefore they were more common and more available. So if you had money, you were more likely to get your hands on a mail shirt than on a helmet. So now we come to leather armor. So of course we all know these cliches with Vikings wearing soft leather armor that wouldn't protect them at all. Of course that wouldn't be the case, but it could happen that someone wore something like leather scale armor, leather lamellar, or something like that, because that is protective. It's definitely not as protective as something like mail or something like that, but it still offers some protection. And it also is rather easy to make. The raw material is not that hard to get, it's just leather, and you don't need that much skill to make it. So it could exist. However, as for leather helmets, I have found no evidence whatsoever for use of leather armor, if it's a scale, lamellar, anything, nothing. I found nothing. So it might have happened that one or two guys used it, but most likely it was an extremely rare armor, if it even existed. And that is probably the case because if you go out and make a leather armor, you're suddenly making armor that has the only purpose to be used as an armor. It's not going to keep you hot as something like a Gambeson. It's just an armor, and you can only use it as an armor. However, what could and did definitely exist is fur. And again, this is to keep yourself warm more than protecting you. A little bit of fur is not going to protect you against assault / anything like that. Everyone knows that. But it is something that they would use to keep themselves hot and as normal clothing. However, I don't think that that is something that would be put on to fight. I would rather think that is something that you would put off to fight. Because if I am wearing this and I'm fighting, most likely it's just going to bounce around, it is going to come everywhere, it's going to slide down, I'm going to get my weapon stuck in it, and it's just going to be horrible to fight with. So not very practical to wear, it's going to keep you hot, which is not good in a fight. So it just overall is something you'd probably not want to wear. Of course, probably some did, and also fur coats also existed, which would be used instead of Gambesons and stuff like that. So yes, fur was probably used even as a sort of armor to a certain degree. Yes, it was used, it was not too common though. And now we can start looking at other armors, because mostly people just think that it stops at Gambeson, mail, potentially leather or fur, but usually it stopped there. In reality, the Vikings could use some other kinds of armor in small amounts. For example, scale armor or lamellar was definitely not the most common kinds of armor, and only some very few ones might use it, but it still existed. So if you talk about lamellar, for example, this particular lamellar here is a specific model from Birka, which is a place in Sweden. So it has literally been found in Sweden and is from the Viking age, so it is basically a Viking armor that someone once wore, and that guy was a so-called Viking. So it is definitely something that would have been used, but only very, very few people would actually use them. Now, what is important to mention about lamellar and other Slavic kind of armor in general that was used in the Viking Age is that mostly they only acquired it through trade, or potentially through mercenaries that came from a certain area and fought for certain Viking kings or jarls, and that wore these armors here. And that trade was really common through, for example, the Baltic Sea. But this means that most of armors like the lamellar were used in Denmark and Sweden, because those have direct contact with the Baltic Sea. It was not that common in Norway and Iceland because, well, if you want to have an armor coming from, let's say, Russia, through the Baltic Sea up to Sweden, it's most probably just going to stop there. You need to have another round of trade for it to come up to Norway, and then another one for it to come up all the way up to Sweden. So extremely rare that these armor would exist in Iceland, but they were not so uncommon in Sweden or Denmark. Now we have scale armor. We have found no scale armors, so it could have happened that someone had scale armors, but you just haven't found them. However, those were even rarer than the lamellar and were definitely not used by a lot of people. And then we also have arm guards and greaves. So these particular arm guards here are based off of certain examples from Birka, the same place as that lamellar is from. So that is again a place within the Viking kingdom and could be used by certain so-called Viking warriors. Again, arm guards and greaves and everything like that would be extremely rare. Only very, very few people would use that, but it could happen that someone used it. Now, I also briefly just want to talk about my whole suit of armor. You might have seen it in other videos. So it's basically mail with the lamellar and arm guards and greaves and this helmet here and so on. I get a lot of questions about it, wondering what kind of armor is that. So it is mostly a Slavic kind of armor, but it could perfectly well exist in Scandinavia as a Viking armor, but would be an extremely high grade armor that would be extremely expensive and only used by extremely elite warriors or kings or something like that. Would definitely not be a common armor. It is, however, historically correct if you have a Viking wearing such an armor. So to conclude, yes, the Vikings did use both Gambeson and Mail, and that was the two most common armors. However, it was also really common to not have any armor, just wearing normal clothes, very common. Approximately 50 to 70% of all so-called Vikings would probably not have any armor at all. In terms of Gambesons, probably 30 to 50% of all Vikings would have Gambesons, and then 2 to 4% would have Mail, and for all the other armors, like Lamella, scale armor, leather armor if it existed, and anything like that, would be extremely rare, and basically under 1% would have that. If you have an army with 100 men, you will not have more than one guy with Lamella, but it did exist and was used, only it was not the common armor at all. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.